So welcome everyone. This is the Stanford Conscious Living Group, and we focus on sharing experience, transformation experiences through different programs that we have. We have programs like mantra meditation exercise. We have yoga wisdom talks. We have conscious cooking classes. So we share these practices so that one can experience transformation and the different aspects of conscious living. So welcome again to today's talk. So today we have a special guest speaker. We have Guru Prasad here, who's going to give a talk on the mind-brain interface. So let's give him a warm welcome by giving a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So let's see. Okay. So thank you everyone for coming today. I'm very excited to be here. Just a bit of background about me. So I just finished my PhD. So just a few weeks ago, I just defended, and I'm excited to come here to Stanford. I was back in Pasadena finishing my PhD in Caltech. So I'm really happy to come here and share some interesting ideas that we've explored over the past few years. So today my talk is titled Exploring the Mind-Brain Interface. And I've chosen this word exploring primarily because we're all still on a journey and we're still trying to figure out what actually the mind is and what potentially its impact on the brain is and the body is. And we're trying to see it from different points of view. We're trying to see it from different frameworks. So before I get actually started, we're all interested in, irrespective of whether we have PhDs or not, we are interested in understanding what reality is. And one of my scientific heroes, Wolfgang Pauli, those of you who've done high school chemistry might remember Pauli's exclusion principle. So I see a lot of nods on the thing. So he mentioned, he described reality as this. I'm going to just read it out. Thank you. So he said, when he speaks of reality, the layman usually means something obvious and well-known, whereas it seems to me that precisely the most important and extremely difficult task of our time is to work on elaborating a new idea of reality. This is also what I mean when I always emphasize that science and religion must be related in some way. So I'm currently trying to potentially see the world from a different view, from a different light, like how Feynman used to say, and trying to see if we can define reality in a very interesting, or in a more, have a model for reality, which is more closer to reality than trying to deny reality in some sense. So I also have to thank my team. So I'm a part of a consortia. We call the BI Neuro Consortia, and we have a lot of researchers, almost 50 plus researchers across the globe who are working on this, I would say, interesting area of science where we're trying to understand what the mind is, what the brain is, and potentially the interface between it. And recently we've written our first publication, which is called the Mind-Brain Interface. I unfortunately have just one copy, which I'm not willing to sell, but I'm happy to speak about it and potentially show, I can show it around if you guys are interested. We have a bunch of different topics that we've kind of trying to understand deeply, and we are in the process of trying to explore these topics from the scientific point of view, as well as trying to see if there are frameworks from Eastern philosophy that could potentially help us better understand these ideas. Okay, so let's embark on a journey. Like any journey, there are prerequisites. So if you want to buy a ticket, you have to pay some money, but I'm not going to ask you any remuneration. You need to have some qualification, and the qualification here is not a PhD, but I do have a small request. The request is, please relax your cognitive blinders. And what I mean by that is, typically when we, because of the way we've been trained since high school or college or PhD, we have a way we look at the world. So for instance, something that my teachers, when they first caught me like 5 years ago when I started studying Eastern philosophy. They asked me to do the same thing. And I said, yeah, I'm always open-minded. And then when they asked me this question, they're like, so what do you think is the cause of all causes in some sense? And I said, yeah, we need to reason everything with respect to there should be a physical cause at the end of the day. If there is no physical cause, I don't think we are speaking science anymore. And that's when they said, no, that need not be always the case. And there could be a non-physical cause as well. At least a good hypothesis could be there could be a non-physical cause, but there is also possibility of having a physical cause, right? And so I'm going to speak today about two seemingly disparate fields. One is on neuroscience, something that I've thought a lot about. And here's actually how a real brain looks when you pick up in your hands. Thank you. Sorry. Oh, it's all right. Thank you. And I'm going to speak a little bit about developmental biology, just a very small amount. And what I see the connecting the connecting framework that can potentially link these two disparate fields is something what we call the mind, or in Eastern philosophy, we call the subtle body. And so what is the mind? Sorry, there you go. Okay. So what is the mind? It's a very complex, most people do not know how to define it. But I do say that the mind is currently, it's gradually gaining some popularity even in the scientific circles. So traditionally, when we think of the mind, we always refer to it in psychology or even in psychiatry, but it's rarely referred to in the hard sciences. So I'm from a neuroscience, from an artificial intelligence background. And when we talk about the mind, we typically reduce it to the brain. We say mind, it has to be reduced to the brain because that's what we understand. We can actually manipulate the brain. So therefore, let's talk about the brain. Let's not talk about the mind. So although, so the question I'm posing to all of you, we're all kind of travelers in this journey. Is this a reasonable model of the world? Is it possible for us to completely reduce all that we know about our mental experience, our perception, everything to a physical neural cause? And that's a question that I want to just like have for each one of you to just deliberate upon. And instead, or the other option is the mind could potentially be treated as its own entity. And would that help us build a more holistic model of the world? And finally, the $1 million or $1 billion or $1 trillion question is, who is the subject that actually possesses the mind and the body? Because when I say I can witness my thoughts, so who is that I in that whole equation? This is out of the scope for this talk, but I will basically hint upon what the Eastern philosophical framework suggests and how it brings the subject into the equation. Okay. So so when I started off my PhD, I was thinking a lot about why do we, when we think of the mind, we always reduce it to the brain. And I was thinking, why in history of science, why did we actually do that? And that's when I came across this thought experiment. How many of you heard of Wittgenstein? Oh, great. A lot of philosophers in the room. Great. So Ludwig Wittgenstein was a phenomenal philosopher of language. And he had this interesting thought experiment, which was the beetle in a box experiment. And let's try this out with all of you. Okay? So each one of you gets a box. And in that box is a beetle. And I tell you that whatever you see in your box, you call it a beetle. And no one else has access to that box, and no one else can peep into that box. So now, Wittgenstein argues that there is no point of actually speaking about such a box or such a beetle, because no one else can verify if that box actually had a beetle or not. Because each one of you are given a box, it's a private box. You could open the box and be like, it's empty, but I'm going to call it empty space beetle. Or it could be a cricket, and I'm going to call that cricket a beetle, and so on and so forth. So potentially there are, so therefore he argues there's no point of speaking about that box. But why is this whole thing relevant to what I'm speaking about? Why is it relevant to mind brain? Because in our case, that personal box that we have is our mind. And the beetle are our thoughts, our desires, our emotions, our memories, our pains. So my way, the one thing that I would suggest is, let's not deny that we may not be able to speak about this box. For instance, when I go to the doctor and the doctor asks me how much is my pain, I'm going to say, oh, I think I have this much pain, and then they'll change my dosage of morphine according to what I respond to. I can never describe my pain completely, but that doesn't imply that my pain doesn't exist. And there exists a sensation. So always coming down to the fundamentals, let's not try to deny that there exists a private space, but at the same time, let's try to see if we can speak about it in a much more coherent manner, in some sense. So given that our minds are extremely complex, private, subjective, how do we actually model our mental world currently? So I'm going to talk about 3 different models right now. So one is the functionalism model, where a group of philosophers, I think headed mostly by Patrick and Patricia Churchland, Daniel Dennett, what they suggest is that the mind in itself it doesn't exist. And all that exists is the brain and its different neural states. And so basically they deny all mental experiences. That's the functionalism model. The other model is epiphenomenalism, where the brain exists, the mind also exists, but the mind is ultimately just a phenomenon of the brain. So you have brain in action and you have the mind. The mind doesn't have any, I would say, causal effect or causal control over the physical structure of the brain. And finally, there is another model, the emergent materialism model, where the brain produces the mind, and the mind can also control the brain or basically impact certain changes in the brain. So let's try to test out. Now what I'm going to do is actually a fun thing where I'm going to basically show you a bunch of observations that are generally present. And we'll look at each and every experiment. We'll look at different experimental investigations, and we'll try to assess what models actually make sense and what do not. Okay, so how many of you have heard of patient HM? Oh yeah, I see 1 hand, 2 hands, great. So famously known as Henry Molaison. This was in the circa 60s, 1960s. And he suffered from epileptic seizures. And as anyone who suffers from epileptic seizures, they would go to the neurosurgeon, try to see what's the root cause of the problem, and try to see if there is a way to actually mitigate it. And the doctors, they were able to trace out a particular spot in the brain that actually caused this epilepsy, or they thought caused epilepsy. They removed that region. And surprisingly, the part that they removed was actually called the hippocampus, which is considered to be responsible for storing memories. And interestingly, after the surgery, Henry Molaison was treated. He didn't have epilepsy anymore, but he couldn't store any new memory. So he had a memory span of less than 30 seconds. So every time he would speak to someone, for 30 seconds, he would play probably one chess move. And then the next, he's like, what am I doing here? Why am I here? What is this chess move? So he would have just a span of 30 seconds. But he remembered all his memories prior to the surgery, which kind of suggests that although we give a lot of emphasis that the hippocampus is responsible for storing memories, yes, it is for actually capturing some of the short-term memories, but the long-term memories are not necessarily stored in the hippocampus itself. It potentially could be spread across the brain or could be stored somewhere else. That's an open question still, but that's something that we learned from Henry Molaison. And so here, what I'm saying is we changed a part of the brain. We basically removed a huge chunk of the brain, the hippocampus, and we see that it definitely affects the mental state, which is your memories or your capability of storing any new memories. All right, so here's a video of this patient who again suffered from epilepsy, and this is more circa 2020s, and this was in Stanford, so it's actually in the Stanford Medical School. So what they've done here is they've basically inserted electrodes across different regions of the brain. And there's a specific region called the face fusiform region. And the face fusiform region is supposed to have representations of different faces. So when you potentially go and stimulate the face fusiform region, the expectation is that you would potentially see different faces. And now they have electrodes implanted in him, and we'll just see what he says.
And tell me what happens when I do this, all right? 1, 2, 3. Nothing. Okay. I'm going to do it one more time. Look at my face. 1, 2, 3.
You just turned into somebody else.
Tell me
Your
about
face metamorphosed. Your nose got saggy, went to the left. You almost looked like somebody I'd seen before, but somebody different. That was a trip.
Could you see my eyes in place?
I could see your eyes, but
All right. So the idea is by stimulating different parts of the fusiform region, what happened was potentially you're eliciting different kinds of facial memories. And as this person's already getting a physical stimuli of someone's face, a doctor's face here, so that basically the memory basically got kind of imprinted over the doctor's face, and therefore you could actually see, he said, you're somebody else, but potentially you're still seeing the doctor. You have this rational memory of, I'm seeing the doctor, but I also kind of feel like you're somebody else because of the specific region that was perturbed. So this section was basically asking, if I perturb my brain circuits, does it change my mental states? And clearly, both the experiments that we've seen so far suggest, yes, it is the case. And therefore, I'm not very happy about the functionalism model myself. That's primarily because I do not want to deny the fact that there exists mental experience and mental states. But of both these models, both the models support the hypothesis that the brain perturbation of the brain actually changes mental states. But we in science care about Occam's razor, where we find the simplest model that can explain a particular observation. So we'll go with epiphenomenalism as the proposed strategy of modeling the world or modeling the mind-brain interface. So now the next more interesting question is, can conscious thought affect the brain, and where and who exerts will? So we did another experiment. So there are a couple of people, researchers, I think in University of Washington, who did this experiment. And what they did was they had a simple task. The task was to learn a specific 5-finger exercise on a piano. So you use your right hand and you basically want to learn a specific 5-finger exercise. And there are 3 groups. So you have the control group. The control group basically doesn't do anything. They just don't, you just basically select a bunch of people and you don't ask them to train. You just let them do their own thing. There's another group where they physically practice the piano, and they're actually learning the 5-finger key. They're training one hand. And the third group is when they're mentally practicing the piano. And when I say mentally practicing, what they're doing is they're actually thinking about moving a finger, hitting the key, and ideally remembering the tone that it's producing, and all of that over and over and over again. And to make sure that they're actually not moving their fingers just by, like, they basically asked to tie their hands behind, and so that they don't touch anything. And also they should not move their fingers, because it's possible that maybe moving their fingers could actually change, certain circuitry in the brain. So let's not move their fingers. And that they also record using EMG sensors so that they're not actually moving their fingers. And what we see is we actually have like cortical motor mapping. So by doing cortical motor mapping, we look at the control case, and these are the specific motor maps corresponding to the finger flexor and the finger extensor regions in the brain. And we see that there's almost no change over the duration of 5 days. And when you look at the one who's physically playing the piano, we expect a change in the cortical motor map. And yes, there is a change in the cortical motor map. And lo and behold, just by thinking about playing the piano, what happens is you again have a cortical change in the motor map, which kind of suggests that, so I can consciously direct my attention towards certain things, and I can consciously keep trying to remember or trying to exert mental force, and that would potentially also change the architecture or the neural structure in my brain. It's a little scary to think of it that way, but it is a fact. So now, when we think of now let's see, our models are evolving, because now we don't just have brain activity that can basically, perturbing brain activity causes mental activity, but at the same time, we have mental activity that can potentially change brain processes. So emergent materialism seems like an interesting model to consider, but I feel personally that this model still doesn't capture the entire story. And the primary reason is because they've completely taken the person who is actually exerting that force, that mental force, or that conscious attention. Because there's ultimately there's a person who is actually exerting that force, who is and then there is mental activity, and then there is so now I think there is a need to invoke a slightly new framework and to think of things slightly differently. And that's where we, a couple of the group I mentioned earlier, the BI Neuro group, have a really good set of philosophers who spend a lot of time studying Eastern philosophy. And that's when we thought, let's try to see if there might be an interesting framework in Eastern philosophy that we can actually adapt for our particular use case. So we can adapt, so we can evolve our model to explain certain observations. So the interesting thing about Eastern philosophy is it's full of metaphors. So that's one way, so you always need a teacher, or you need someone who's really well trained to actually understand Eastern philosophy. And the other thing is, it's usually encoded in Sanskrit. So if you're not a Sanskrit expert, it usually is more difficult to extract. But I think, again, thanks to some of my teammates who are experts in both, I'm going to just give you a very brief explanation of what that analogy, or what the analogy, what the metaphor itself is. But they compare our entire existence, our mental model, or our just existence to a chariot with 5 horses. So the idea is the 5 horses here are the 5 senses, the knowledge senses, where we acquire knowledge about the world from our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and touch. So those are the 5 horses. The charioteer, or the reins of the horse, are basically the mind. They're compared to the mind. The charioteer, who's actually controlling the mind and the senses, is the intelligence. And finally, the person who's sitting, who's kind of freaking out here, but the person who's sitting on the chariot is the subject, or the person itself. So the question that I had earlier brought about when I said that if I say it's my mind, I'm witness to my thoughts. So the I, the person, is potentially sitting out here, who's being dragged by the chariot. And the chariot itself is referred to as the body, the physical body. So now having understood this metaphor and this framework, let's try to adapt and say, we already had emergent materialism talking about brain causing mental activity, but now we're going to add another person, the subject itself, who can exert that free will to basically direct his or her conscious attention, and then that would potentially change mental activity. So now we have a slightly updated way to look at the mind-brain interface. So now, natural question most people ask me, especially as a neuroscientist, is why does it matter? Okay. Why does it functionally matter? Does it functionally matter, or does it not? And again, here's another case study where there's where it's an interesting case study because this particular medical practitioner tried to apply this framework in their treatment plan, and they wanted to see how change can be brought about. So all of you know about obsessive compulsive disorders, and here is an example of one patient. Her name's Dottie, and she's a middle-aged woman who is just a young mother, and she has a fear of numbers 5 and 6. So when we think of fear of numbers, it's not just a very trivial fear. The fear was so, I would say, intense that every time while she was driving, when she would actually encounter a number 5 or 6 on any number plate somewhere, she would be forced to pull over, wait over there until a lucky number, a car with a lucky number would pass by before she actually takes off. So this was her, it was a pretty difficult to have such an obsessive thought continuously. And once she had a son, she had another obsessive disorder, which was every time she felt that she would make the smallest of disturbance to wake her son up, her son would go blind. And that was, it might seem irrational to us, but that was a very strong thought that drove her, I would say, very almost nuts. So then the question is, how do you actually go about treating such a thing, right? So how do we treat OCD? And I'm going to just show you how the field has evolved over the last 50 years now. So until the 1960s, OCD was considered treatment intractable. So you didn't have any treatment for OCDs. But 1960s to 70s, there was what happened was there were a lot of antidepressant drugs that were being administered, like Prozac, for instance. And they said, why don't we instead administer these drugs for also OCD, for treating OCD? And what these drugs typically do is they basically go and block certain channels in your neurons. And these channels are required for reuptake of serotonin from your outside the neuron. There's a bunch of serotonin, and that continuously gets reuptaken by the neuron. And so if you block that, this amount of serotonin in the brain is very high. So it potentially would decrease it would alleviate some of the OCD symptoms. This worked, but the only problem is it was not a long-term solution because people were hooked onto these drugs. Then from the 1970s to 1990s, there was this whole phase of treatment called and response prevention, which basically means it's when I was reading about it, I felt it was like torture to the OCD patient, because say, for instance, if a person has OCD for dirty gloves, every time they see dirty gloves, they need to get themselves washed, at least wash their hands for a few minutes. Now, the way they treat this, the treatment paradigm was, if a person has an OCD for dirty gloves, we'll give them dirty gloves, we'll make them wear it, and we'll prevent. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. All right. It clearly shows how difficult it is for the OCD patient. Was it the amber alert? Yeah, amber alert. Oh yeah, it's noise. Yeah. So, the idea is they would make the patient wear these dirty gloves and prevent them from responding to it. And they would just and it was basically like, in some ways, it's stoic treatment where they would just be like, suffer it out. But that way, there was actually people who did go through the entire paradigm. Almost 65% of them actually had a decrease in their OCD, OCD, I would say, compulsive thoughts. But most of them didn't go through the entire paradigm because most of them were very fearful to even get they were fearful of actually being exposed to that scenario over and over again. And by the 1980s, we had this deep understanding of molecular neuroscience. So we said, no, I think it. I keep circling. All of us will get it eventually. Yeah. So so in the 1980s, we started asking, can we find actually molecular markers for OCD, and can we design molecular targets? So there was a lot of studies that was done on finding the cause of OCD, and I'm going to go a little bit into detail here, where the current model that we understand is there are a couple of brain regions that are responsible. There's the orbitofrontal cortex, which is supposed to contain the error alarm circuits, where every time something's amiss in the environment, these circuits would basically keep firing. And when these guys fire, you'd end up having the anterior cingulate, which is the pain region in the brain, and you'd have the caudate, which is also another region, which is basically going to keep reinforcing that same situation over and over again. So you're basically caught in some weird feedback loop. And that's why when you speak to OCD patients, they would be like, I cannot just break out of it. And for obvious reasons, it's very difficult because they had this neural loop as well. So now question is, there are two ways. Now, how do we solve it? Now, how do you make these large-scale changes? Because it's ultimately there are different large regions of the brain that are responsible for causing these obsessive thoughts. So there are, again, two ways to do it. One, we can go the one route where we say, okay, everything boils down to brains. So, and I know there is a cause there is a problem in a brain circuit. So why don't I change the brain circuit? Why don't I do some kind of drug discovery, find a molecular target, and then potentially it would change my mental state. It would change those obsessive thoughts. The other way, however, is I actually acknowledge the fact that there exists a top-down approach where I consider there is a person. The person can have some conscious, can be self-directed and can basically use some conscious effort to distract their minds, to basically alleviate some of those thoughts when it comes. And that could potentially change the neural circuitry. So there are two ways. One is the normal go take a pill and have it. And the other way is actually use conscious effort to get rid of it. So I know someone's name was Jeffrey here, but the doctor who actually proposed this is Jeffrey Schwartz at UCLA. And he said, he basically started this clinical trial, and he had around, I think, 50 to 60 patients who signed up for it. And the whole idea was to go drug-free and to actually use free will and a particular procedure to actually go to alleviate some OCD symptoms. And so he calls it the mindful awareness for OCD treatment. And there are 4 steps, but I'm going to talk about 3 here. The first step is to relabel. And the idea is this requires a lot of conscious effort. Every time this obsessive thought comes to your mind, take a mental note of it, and not just take a mental note of it's the obsessive thought versus not an obsessive thought, but actually try to describe the exact feeling. And this is also called cognitive restructuring. But this sometimes is not enough by just taking a note. What you actually want, what he noticed once was one of his patients was tried this exercise for a while, came back to him and told, "Doctor, it's not working. I still have those bad days where, these thoughts keep coming over and over again." And then he basically, that time, Jeffrey Schwartz, what he did was he basically showed him an image of a PET scan of his brain and said, there's this dark, big black spot here, and that's the cause of your, and that's when he realized, oh, so it's the brain, it's not me. So then so this is called reattributing. So when he showed these PET scans, and the patient was able to attribute those aberrant messages to malfunctioning wiring of the brain and not to the true self, that already was one phase of actually kind of getting over the OCD symptom itself. Mm. And the final was refocusing. And the refocus idea was the dread and anxiety still would remain, irrespective of if I say if it's because of my malfunctioning brain or not. So therefore, every time you have an obsessive thought, try to refocus it on something pleasant, something familiar, a good habit. And by doing this procedure for 2 months, there was a therapy, and you have a therapist who was helping you with this process. So then they did this clinical trial for 2 months, and then they wanted to see if it changes your brain structure itself. And here, the diagram on the left is your pre, and this is post-treatment. So what I want to point out is this. So you see here, this is the caudate, which is actually firing up, which means there is an obsessive compulsive issue. And post, you see this is your caudate, the left caudate here, or the right caudate. And that basically has almost no firing activity. It's more like a normal person with no obsessive thoughts, which clearly shows that by directed conscious effort, one is actually able to even change one's neural circuitry and change the loop itself. So I think that's one of the reasons why having an understanding of the holistic framework could potentially help with even long-term medical therapeutics and medical solutions. Okay, so from now on, these are questions that we are still exploring, and the group that we have, we're excited to work with a lot more people. So if any one of you are interested in exploring some of this with us, please let us know. We'll be happy to have you. But some of the questions that we're excited about right now is, obviously, I've basically abstracted. I said the subject. Subject has some control over their mental space, and that controls the physical. But then the natural question is, what's that interface between my mental states and the physical body? And that's I would say this is again a very, very important but very difficult question. And we are trying to figure out different ways to explore it. And we think, so in other words, the language for translating the mental states to a physical, and one potential intermediate is bioelectricity itself. Of course, there are many mechanisms how we could get here, but for now, why do we say it's actually bioelectricity? Is because another experiment in attention kind of points to this. So here, when I show you this image, this is like finding Waldo. Say, for instance, I'm telling you, I'm priming you with, there is a person who's playing football, and your eyes would go hover somewhere and you'd find that, despite a lot of distraction, right? So the idea in attention is, every time you basically see this image, if you consider a deterministic way of processing information, the image is constant. It's the same stimuli, and the same information potentially would be going all the way to your visual cortex. But when I tell you to start focusing on something, if you guys were implanted with electrodes and if you had EEG or an EEG, I would already know that the specific region, say for instance, the region that's processing red, the region that's processing football, that would potentially ramp up in its local field potentials. And that's an experimentally well known. So active focus attention to a specific attribute, such as color, potentially ramps up the activity of regions of the brain that possess that attribute or that process that attribute. So that's why when I tell voluntary attention potentially results in this ramp up in local field potentials. That's one of the reasons why we feel that the interface between going from mental states, something that's very non-physical, to actually the physical substrate is bioelectricity. So just to recap, so far we have this updated model of the world where we have a subject, the person who can actually have conscious control over mental states, and that mental states could affect the brain and the brain's architecture, not just the brain, but the entire body. And you also have the brain basically affecting the mind and so on and so forth. So one thing that I found very interesting in Eastern philosophy is that they made this very interesting, it's an interesting prediction. And they talk about the universality of this framework. This framework is not limited to just humans, but it's actually all living entities potentially could possess this framework. And we can start thinking of what does it mean for another living entity, or let's say, there's a famous philosophical question: how does a bat think, or what does it mean to be a bat? So in the Bhagavad Gita, one of the prime texts of the Eastern philosophy, there's a very interesting verse which basically suggests. It goes this way. So I'll read out the Sanskrit. Dehinosmin yatha dehe kaumaram yauvanam jara tata dehantara prapti dhiras tatra na muhyati. So the idea is, as the embodied subject continuously passes from one body to another, which is within this, we go from boyhood to youth to old age, the subject similarly passes into another body at death. And they basically are kind of alluding to the idea of reincarnation. And they're alluding to the idea that the subject potentially, this framework potentially exists across all living entities. And one can ask, so that's why I started thinking, that's where my link is actually now to going to development, because as we, intuitively speaking, some of us are probably older than the others. And when you describe your when you describe about yourself, like maybe 20 years ago, you say, this is how I was when I was 20 years ago, intuitively speaking, right? But although we know very clearly that most of our body parts have already changed, be it, we've changed in our brain circuits, not just our synapses, we know all of this. We have the neurons that are changing, there's continuous turnover of all of that. So in that scenario, the same idea kind of holds across all living entities. And even during development, we can understand that the subject remains the same, but the bodies are constantly changing.
May I ask you a question about the problem of using living entities?
Yeah, sure.
How far does that extend? Do you mean like animal kingdom, or are you saying plants as well?
I'm saying actually everyone. Yes, animals and plants. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the clarification. Now the question that we still have to ask ourselves is, does the microbe or the bacteria count as living or not? That's again an open question. But for this discussion, I would say the plant and animal kingdom also is considered. So we have subject, we have the mind, and then we say there's this bioelectric framework for actually transferring some information from the subtle body, which could be to actual development. And now an important question in developmental biology. I know some of you are developmental biologists, based on the RSVP list that I saw. An important question that plagues us is, how does a cell collective know it's going to form a particular organ, right? So what I mean by that is, as during development, you basically start as a single cell. You start as a zygote, and you keep growing. You have multiple cells. You have different totipotent cells, pluripotent cells, and they have certain fates. Some of them become the brain, some of them become the legs, some of them become different parts of your body. Now the question is, once you have a mass of cells, like say a tissue, how does this tissue know what to proceed to? And there are two broad ways to think about it. One is the more bottom-up approach, where we know that, ultimately, we are the blueprint of life as defined from 1964, after James Watson and Crick actually found the DNA was the blueprint. You have the DNA, which basically transcribes to RNA, which translates to proteins. And as you're moving through development, you end up having different sets of RNA and protein that are formed, which potentially changes the direction your cell is going to evolve with. But then there's another approach, which we say is you actually have the subject who's always present, you have the subtle body, the mind, and then you have the bioelectric framework, and that results in the physiology. Both can be integrated in one framework, no doubt about it. But my question is it possible for us to change the fate of a living or let's say a living organism, right? And change the fate while development without changing the DNA. So typically when we think of, I want to change, say for instance, if I want to change the fate of certain stem cells to go to forming the heart or to the cardiac or to the neurotissues, I would ideally go and modify the DNA itself. But is it possible for us to instead go the top-down approach without touching the DNA or the RNA? Can I actually change the physiology? So a special interesting case study is in planaria. So planaria is it's a flatworm. It's very well known for its phenomenal regeneration capabilities. What I mean by regeneration is if I can actually take a planaria, it's already pretty tiny, but you can actually cut it into 270 small pieces like this, 270 cuts, and each piece grows into an entire planaria. So a natural question is, it seems like every cell, almost every cell, kind of encodes the entire blueprint of the whole organism. And the fun thing is, each of these guys know exactly when to stop in growing. It's not that one becomes more longer than the other or something like that. It's like everyone knows I need to be a planaria. I'm this size. I'm going to just grow from here. So definitely a lot of open questions in this area, why this happens. There are many ideas of how this could be encoded. But there is a slightly different thing that I want to point out. And recently, there were experiments in Mike Levine's group at Tufts University, where they said, can we now, so I'm bringing it from the top-down approach. I'm not going to change the genome of the organism. I'm not going to touch RNA or any of that, but I'm going to change bioelectricity of the general bioelectricity. What do I mean by bioelectricity? Seems like a fancy term that I've not described before. So when we think of brains, we say that there are neurons, they fire. And what I mean by fire, basically they have an active, so every cell has a membrane, and there is basically there's a membrane potential difference between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. And by changing these membrane potentials, potentially you can speak between different cells. There's a language that you can use for the cells to speak with each other. So now here in this experiment, what they've done is they say, can I change the way the electrical communication between different cells in the planaria? That is, each cell here has a bunch of ion channels, and the ion channels are the way they basically send out ions between different cells, and that's their communication. So by changing that, what we see is you can actually get a two-headed planaria. So you can actually change the fate of cells by just modifying the bioelectricity itself. And this is kind of where it spins the paradigm around. It basically says, you don't need to know the DNA or the genome. It's not that I'm saying it's not important. It's definitely important, no doubt. But at the same time, it's not everything. There are ways to actually change the software without having to actually change the hardware. Like for instance, so here, the electrical software that's kind of that we can still have access to is one of the hypotheses is that the subtle body controls that electrical software. But that's again a big hypothesis, and we are still working towards finding experiments trying to prove that out in some ways.
But
Yes.
you artificially charge the cell, or at least the segment of that planaria on different sides then?
Yes. So
You
The-
held it in place.
Yes, so actually what we did is, instead of actually having to charge it or to place an electric field, what is being done is you actually soak it. So typically these planaria live in clear water. So what you do is you soak it in some solution called 1-octanol. So what 1-octanol does is blocks the gap junctions. It blocks ion communication between different cells. And you soak it over there for 2 to 3 days. You remove it out from there and keep it in fresh water. The planaria is perfectly fine. It just moves around. It does its own thing. I'm talking about the one-headed planaria, right? So, but it has a counterfactual memory, which means it has memory for what it's going to be after you cut it, which is very fascinating because now I take the same planaria, I cut it, and then afterwards, as soon as I cut it, what you end up is you have a memory to actually generate 2 heads because I've already changed the ion distribution and the communication. Now, the exact mechanism is still, we're trying to figure out why these, what is the exact basis of the mechanism. But these are some of the observations that we have made so far.
And then the other section, if you did that, it would still be the same as well. Then
Exactly.
too.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. And we don't need to only go to a 2-headed, we can actually go to a no-headed.
That's what I'm saying.
that's
That's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. I think, am I on time? I think I went faster than usual, but anyways. All right, but I think that's pretty much most of it. So concluding remarks are, one is we have a updated way to look at the world and the way to look at ourselves. So typically we only talk about the brain, or we talk about the brain and the mental states, but actually don't care about mental states and just reduce it to the brain. But we have good reason to say, let's look at a much more holistic model of our world. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done, that needs to be explored. We still need to understand what are the interfaces, what are the different layers of intermediates that are required to actually speak between mental states all the way to your physical body. And all models are wrong, but some are useful. So definitely, this is one such model, and we can definitely evolve and create as we learn more about these systems. And also another thing that I just want to, very grateful for all of you to be here and giving me this opportunity to share something really unconventional, because in a typical research seminar talk, what I've noticed is we typically try to stick to a particular scientific paradigm that the community is well versed with. But here, we would like to ideally base we can create a story according to the observation. So let's keep observations and let's keep experiments as our I would say on the forefront, and try to see what models can we build to actually explain that entire corpus of experiments. With this, thank you very much for your attention. Open to questions.
Go ahead.
Yes.
What tool are you using to cut the hair?
So we can use, so there are actually, we can use a small razor as well too. Yeah, like, or even a small brush as well to cut it, because they're already pretty, I would say, fluffy animals. So it's easier to cut. You can use a razor though, but you have to definitely sanitize it, make sure that they're already in the media.
My question is when the two-headed planaria got generated, but according to the blueprint, it should know that it should have just one head. So does it mean that it forgot that it had a head and then it just generated another head? Or is there some kind of like update?
So
was there any other like reason as to why it should have 2 heads?
So one way to think about it is the hardware kind of allows you to install many different softwares. Like for instance, if I give you, we have a laptop, right? My hardware is like, say, the Mac M1, right? And I can definitely install, like, I can have Microsoft Word on it. I can have my MATLAB program running. I can have Python running. All of these different software can be installed on this particular hardware. So the same way, the DNA base is basically providing you a nice hardware where you can actually change your software to have different physiologies. That's one way to think about it. And ultimately, the question is, again, what actually carries the blueprint itself? Like, who carries the blueprint for this entire construction? That's something that's still to be explored and understood.
Have you seen that these electric gradients are able to change how the polarity, how the gradient of proteins expressed also changes?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's actually, we are exploring that. We're trying to see what's the, we've not, so specifically so there are a bunch of morphogen gradients that we are looking at. Morphogen gradients themselves, some of the morphogen proteins that we are looking at do not actually have they don't change while we actually change the bioelectric gradients itself. So another interesting thing is one way, so if I cut the planaria, like say bisect it into half, right? How does it know that it needs to create a head and a tail? And one proposal that's been made is there's an exponential gradient of the morphogens starting from my head to the tail. And based on the concentration of that morphogen gradient, I know exactly I need to create a head or a tail. But an argument can be made that if you go just a few, just like delta or an epsilon, move to the left of the gradient, left of that cut and right of that cut, you know that the left one actually ends up becoming the head and the right one becomes the tail. So that might not be completely explanatory. So the morphogen gradient alone might not explain why actually a particular cell has a particular fate. But that's an interesting exploration that we need to do, like to see if other morphogen gradients get changed based on our.
And the other question I have is that I could see more in invertebrates. So you're pointing to electric currents. So I assume it's like a dominance of electrical synapses than the neural synapses that are having this effect. So would you expect a similar kind of effect in vertebrates, for example? Because this electrical synapse is a very underexplored,
Yes.
but an amazing field.
Yes.
But currently what we know about it is limited in terms of just connections
Yes.
in mice, for example.
Correct.
But do you see, is there any preliminary experiments?
So actually the whole reason for starting planaria is to actually understand the regeneration capability finally for humans. And bioelectricity exists even in humans also. Like we have gap junctions, we have all of that, no doubt. But can we actually tap into that? That's a question that we don't know yet. And that's something which will take a few more, I'd say, years to figure out if we can actually do those experiments. Yeah, but it already, the whole inspiration comes from looking at intelligence, or when we think of the brain, we think of it as an electrical machine most of the times. So, and the same electrical components, because at the end of the day, like you have neurons speaking to each other, they have these spikes. So the same idea is basically brought to non-neuronal tissues, and those same non-neuronal tissues exist in humans. So we feel like there might be a way to kind of move from a invertebrate to a human at some future point, but we've not done any preliminary studies on this.
So you basically immerse the planaria into
Yeah.
solution.
Yes.
So do you do it with the whole planaria or do you cut it in?
So in this case, they've done it actually for the whole planaria.
But then every time you do it, it should be a planaria with two, right?
Not necessarily. You actually do it for a planaria with one head. So you do it for a planaria with one head for 2 to 3 days, and then you take it out and you place it in your clear water. The whole idea is that the solution, like the octanol solution, basically is in some way has changed the way your cells communicate with each other electrically, and that's like a memory that's basically kind of stored in the planaria. So for the next time you actually cut the planaria, it bases this its new form, or it generates a new physiology depending on the memory that was stored, which is basically based on your bioelectric current.
So you're saying that a double-headed planaria, if you cut it or cut it in a section again, it will develop a double-headed
Exactly.
planaria.
That's right.
Wow.
That's exactly right. That has been shown as well. Yeah, that's right.
I was wondering, are you familiar with what neural links are? So they're exploring the brain and the machine, interface. Is it possible? Do we know anything? I would feel like the reverse, like using what they learned, that how to interpret, the brain waves to actually use that to change the electricity that Can help with the OCD, that kind of stuff.
It's a great point. I don't know if people, I don't know, I've not seen research on this front where people have used the brain-machine interface itself to treat like an OCD. But I mean, I know that like there's a lot of work on macaques, especially to actually see if record their motor cortex and try to see if you can control the joystick to do certain activities. Yeah, so the way usually it works is your basic, so the because the, again the beauty, this is again because of the beauty of the new, because how plastic our brains are. So it all boils down to that, because you can potentially take any part of the motor cortex, that part of the motor cortex may not actually be encoding for your hand movement. So you basically recording from it, and then you have, then afterwards what you do is you try to simultaneously you have the animal basically doing this movement on the joystick, right? And then you have this feedback loop where you're specifically feeding current to that same patch, so that it basically forces the animal to do that same task. So you have this feedback loop. So you're in some ways, because of the plasticity of the brain, you're able to train the brain-machine interface in that manner. And there's a very like a more extreme experiment was done in Berkeley, where what they did was, we generally say the motor cortex is responsible for motor movements, but why should that be the case? Let's make the auditory cortex, so the thing that we actually use to hear, make that move joystick. So that can also be done, but that depends on the age of the organism, because neuroplasticity when we are very young is very high, and that's why actually kids, so if kids have say some brain defects, a very common experiment, or not common experiment, it's a non-experiment, my bad. It's a common medical treatment was to do a hemispherectomy, which means just take half the hemisphere away. And if that happens for us, we're completely out. But if it happens for a kid, they can, no problem, they'll just be playing around next day, no worries. So that shows so again, there's a deeper question there. Why does plasticity actually change over time? And we also understand from some of these experiments on conscious mental effort, we understand that by consciously thinking or directing our attention, we are able to kind of ramp up the plasticity of those particular regions, which is so it's basically called directed neuroplasticity. And one can wonder, is there what are the other factors that underlie this, which is again an open question. So lots of interesting questions that we can explore. And thanks for bringing that point up.
I have a question about the emergent materialism example that you gave with the piano playing, and it might be an impossible question to answer, so caveat, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. And when you talked about the study with the piano playing, it reminded me of the function during sleep, where we replay certain things that we've learned, and that reinforces the behavior, helps us to perform better on that task, and we're arguably not conscious during sleep. So is it possible that it actually is, I guess it's hard to pin down the mind, but is it possible it's actually just the brain affecting the brain?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So the question is especially about, so the way I understand it. So while you're dreaming, you basically have a bunch of neural activity in your brain. And that neural activity is could potentially be reinforcing certain other brain regions, right? And
there's a study in rats, for example, that when they run a certain maze, that while they're sleeping, you can see like actually it's in reverse, which is kind of interesting. But
yes, I think you're talking about David Frost's work, I guess, where they do basically, okay, so before they enter the maze, they have basically they go like back, they traverse the maze but in the reverse direction in some sense.
Yeah, in their brain,
they
it's
replay
like playing in the reverse direction in which they ran the maze.
Exactly.
But it replays in their brain, and the next day it increases performance.
Exactly.
As compared to ones that were not allowed to sleep.
Yeah. I mean, that's torture for the rats.
Yeah, we're little rats.
Yeah. But I'll have to think about it. But thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, so then, first of all, what was the experiment on one of the kids that you mentioned? They cut a brain.
Oh, the hemispherectomy. HEMIMA.
Okay, I'll probably,
Yeah.
probably the first, right?
Yeah, there you go.
But then my other question was like,
that's interesting how memory can work in reverse then. So then what if you could actually like literally walk back memory and then like relive your day in that sense?
Yeah, I mean,
Well, because like now I'm studying artificial intelligence and that might be possible in artificial intelligence.
that's right. That's right. I mean, again, so it depends on what specific tool you're using. Say, for instance, it's in AI itself, like in neural networks, when we build neural networks, some of the times when we train these networks, it's almost impossible to interpret. Interpretability becomes a big problem. So that's why there's a whole field of explainable AI, where we're trying to actually explain what the machine learning network has actually learned.
Yeah.
So we can go into, so the same thing that neuroscientists do for the brain, where we actually go and poke into every neuron or every synapse. The same thing we potentially do with our neural networks, where we go poke into and see what representations can be done. And I think it's totally doable to actually have the free play even in a neural network.
As far as consciousness goes, is each individual cut like a new being in a sense once it grows, or does it retain its own consciousness?
Yeah. So I mean, so I can tell you from the Eastern philosophy point of view, where at the end of the day, when we talk about the subject, so the subject is basically the entity who actually experiences. So the qualia and all of that is basically experienced by the subject. And as we have development, we have basically the same subject experiences different bodies. So like one of the verses that I showed from the Gita basically suggests that as you're moving through the same life, right? Intuitively speaking, we never say there's someone else who experienced that emotion or that feeling 20 years back. We always say, I experienced it. It's just like, it's just, there's some sort of continuity that's already being intuitively spoken about. And the idea is that the subject remains steady or constant, whereas your body's continuously change. And an extrapolation of that same idea is as you move away, say for instance, after death, the whole idea is you basically take up another body and you move on. So that's the kind of one of the, I would say, principles behind of Eastern philosophical frameworks. So the same consciousness potentially lives in another body. And there's a lot of, actually, I don't know if you guys, because you guys would have seen Netflix, but there's a very nice show called, what was the show's name? Oh yeah, Surviving Death. Thank you. So Surviving Death, check it out. It's episode 6 is really cool because there's a researcher in University of Virginia in the Department of Perceptual Studies, where what they're doing is they've basically documented a bunch of almost 2,500 cases of reincarnation. And the way they basically describe it's a pretty it's a very systematic way to actually capture all these different evidences, and they go one by one and actually verify who's the person, was it a fake, were they just making up a story. And recently, the group that I'm a part of, we've also been fortunate to get a hold of some fMRI scanners. So we would ideally want to go interview the patient and bring them under the fMRI and actually see as they recall memories, because then we can actually see if it's a counterfactual or not. Yes.
Question's not really formulated because I'm still trying to make sense of it, but to me, it seems like what you're presenting is, I mean, the basic framework is in a sense not very different from this newer perspective. So I'm thinking of the SEG video that you showed. You know, basically what they're doing, they have several electrodes implanted in the brain, and then they're delivering electrical pulses to those brains, and there's some sort of interpretation of what those pulses are within that consciousness. And I think that's sort of the definition that we're getting at in the mind. I think that's sort of the root of it is
absolutely.
You never really define what the mind was, and you have such a foundational experience of it, but you can't really describe what it is.
Correct.
And similarly, when you're going top down, you're affecting, in the case of your experiment, those electro or bioelectric gradients and seeing sort of the differences. So does that mean that really the emphasis should be on that electrical activity? I mean, it seems like that's the common denominator between everything. So
far, it seems like that's one, I would say, intermediate that we can explore. But I think over time, I think so the whole idea is that's definitely true. And we could potentially use like bioelectricity as our hook to understand further either top, up, and below as well, like looking at how it interacts with the brain structures itself or the body itself. And I think what we would have to do as scientists are not fear the subjective and also have some ways to define the subjective. Like an example is, for instance, my PhD was in computational neuroscience. So I spent a lot of time studying differential geometry. And one thing that fascinates me a lot is, say if I have, you have all these different, maybe an example from the brain itself, right? So you have the brain, and it has, every time you see a stimulus, you have a particular representation, right? A neural representation in the brain. Now, anyone who would want to decode that representation would be able to decode it only if that representation is the same every time I see the same stimulus. So if I show a stimulus, I see the representation, I decode that representation. So I have a fixed map. But the brain is weird and interesting in that way. There's a phenomenon called representational drift, where what's happening is, as you're viewing the same stimulus, your representations are changing, your representations are drifting. So one of the theories that I proposed in by the end of my PhD was, there could exist a manifold, some sort of topological manifold that underlies, it's an abstract mathematical concept that underlies all these experiences or all these representations itself. And that's like the higher order mechanism that's basically understanding what the actual representation means. So there could be, so I think there are many ways to explore this. One is the more mathematical route of actually going down and understanding what are the topological structures that can be built from these neural activities. And the other way is, the whole idea is to get some inspiration from much larger frameworks to see, maybe let's not in the process of being very simple, let's not completely deny the existence of certain bits in this whole flow chart or this whole puzzle. That's the only kind of push that we are trying to do in this direction. I hope I think I might have gone all over the place, but we can chat about it in person.
When you depolarize the do you consider that creating its bioelectricity, or is this understanding?
That's a good question. So there's a lot of context that might be required. So the idea is, there are these place cells and grid cells in the hippocampus, and they are supposed to record the place that like, for instance, I'm now standing here, and I know I came here a few months ago. So there potentially exists a cell that encodes this particular place. And every time I come into this place, that particular cell fires. And because that cell fires, I kind of know I'm in this particular area. So that's the idea of a place cell. And now that place cell itself has a pretty large radius. So if I'm here versus if I'm here, the same cell will potentially fire. So then obviously, how am I supposed to understand if I'm actually here or here? So I need to actually decipher that also. And there are something called grid cells that actually do that. So you have like a combination of two different kinds of cells that would potentially do this. So to answer her question, so her question was, we can basically depolarize, or we can depolarize these particular cell types. And would that actually would that mean that is bioelectricity? Maybe. I mean, I think it's a naming convention. We can consider it to be that way as well. I would actually, we can say that, because ultimately, when we see, even for instance, I'm interested in seeing when we have voluntary control. So for instance, there is volition, right? I can force a certain object in my attention for extended durations of time, right? That means I can basically, if I can attend to something, and in that attention doesn't depend on the properties of the object itself, that implies that there is some sort of free will there, that I can actually bring something and I can actually attend to it. So then the question is, what is actually changing when I attend to this, when I make this volition? What is changing in my brain circuit? What is actually changing in my neural activity? Maybe another experiment that maybe I'll end with this, but there was an experiment done by, I think, Passingham et al. So what they did was, they had a bunch of subjects and they made them learn an 8-key finger exercise on a keypad. And every time they hit a key, a particular tone would come, right? And simultaneously, while the subject was learning this, they were doing PET scans. And initially, when the person was learning it, the brain was like firing. Everything was like active. Your frontal cortex was active, your executive cortex all of this was active, right? But then after he completely learned it very well, so he kept it, they forced him to do it for an hour. And by the end, it was boring. And as he would do it, like he would just go in autopilot, nothing was firing. It basically quieted. The brain was quiet. Then they did the interesting experiment where they said, now consciously focus on the keypad and now hit it. Back again firing. So clearly that shows that there is some connect, that there is an explanatory gap that exists. And I think it's up to us to figure out how we would potentially bridge that gap between what volition itself is, what is actually acting upon the brain that's actually changing the neural states like almost instantaneously. It's not that the brain is getting rewired, because rewiring takes a while. So then what's actually happening? So it potentially means that there is a sudden ramp of electric potential. And that's why I feel like there is bioelectricity could be that intermediate medium between the volition and your physical substrate. But how does it affect the bioelectricity? Open question. People suggest it could be quantum mechanics, but I don't want, I can always say the one black box is another black box, but I don't know, honestly. So it's up to, we can definitely explore that.
It just came to me, it might be too late for this talk, but for the next iterations, I would add there experiments that basically look at the activity of different cells in your brain. I have to look it up, but they show that they fire up before the active sort of volitional engagement of conscious awareness that you're actually like going to your arm. And so there is that bioelectric activity before even you're aware of it, where you make a decision to make a conscious movement.
Interesting. I think if I'm not mistaken, I think you're referring to there's Jim Libet, who had done a bunch of experiments, Benjamin Libet, on basically if free will exists or not. And there he was making the argument that potentially if you see bioelectric activity before conscious awareness, that means free will doesn't exist because it's already driven by your. But there are a bunch of critics for that as well. But I think next time I'm invited, if I'm invited, I will definitely go for that. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Practically, for a layman who may be struggling with anxiety, depression, daily stress, what should they do in their daily life for the subject to influence the mental state, whether it's an imaginary state or whether it's in the neocortex or limbic system, or where I'm still not sure it's part of the brain or it's separate or imaginary. But practically speaking, whether it's from Eastern philosophy or with science, what should a person do to influence the mental state, which therefore influences the neurons?
No, thank you. That's actually that's one of the most important questions, because that's exactly what we're all understanding. So one of my teachers who I'm inspired by always says science should not just inform but actually transform. So if that's the case, like your question is the most exciting ones, and I don't have a perfect answer for it, but I can share what I've learned from my teacher and from Eastern philosophy itself. So there are a couple of things that could potentially help. One is, as we've seen, how do we actually, sometimes we may lack the will to actually change, because we see that there's a lot of conscious effort that's required to even change certain brain circuits or change certain habits. But if we lack the will, what do we do? So one of the things in Eastern philosophy is sadhu sangha, which basically means association of like-minded people, because that would potentially give you the impetus or give you that will that you currently lack. That's one thing. And then also another thing that's important is just so the other analogy that I talked about with the chariot, where so the senses are always going to keep moving, running around, trying to move towards its sense objects. And ultimately the charioteer is the intelligence is the one who's basically controlling. So by ultimately understanding very deeply why certain things are happening, or how do we actually, or the real reason for why we want to make that change, that will also help. And that could come either from wisdom texts, it could come from studying Eastern philosophy, it could come from studying science, whatever your source might be. One thing that comes to mind is in one of the Eastern texts called the Srimad Bhagavatam, there's a very beautiful story of a person who says he has 20 different teachers, and 20 different teachers are the sky, the earth, the Python. So potentially we all can have like so many different teachers, and whatever kind of change, moves that dial for us. So that's another way we can potentially apply. And the final thing is, I really like thinking of. I like to. So there's a book on, I think, 7 Effective Habits, where they say there's a circle of influence and there's a circle of concern. Usually our circle of concern is much larger than the circle of influence, and that's the cause of almost all our pains. But that being said, I really like to think of being in some sort of control. And if I tell you that, that a particular brain circuit is malfunctioning, what can I do to control it? I might have to go to the neurosurgeon to actually get it fixed, maybe. But I find more, I'd say, this is personal, of course. I find more joy in some ways of knowing that, I can actually, by conscious effort, the mind itself potentially, because it affects the neural architecture flow, it will take care of itself. So I can definitely, I can control it. So we always say control the mind, say control the brain. We don't have volitional control over it in the direct sense. So those are just something that I'm trying.
So a follow-up question, when you say that controlling the mind to control some part of the brain, like, what do you mean? Just meditate upon that, think about it again and again, have a picture of it, like how does that, how do we do that?
I wish I knew the answer. I really wish I knew the answer, but no, I think, like, I mean, the OCD paradigm is pretty helpful for that. So first is, when I was doing this research on OCD, I was very fascinated because it's not just OCD that needs correction. It's actually any habit that we might be stuck in a loop doing. All of that needs correction. So one is, like, first know that it is consciously understand that, that's a habit that needs to be changed. That's your relabeling idea. The next thing is to reattribute. So this is to actually understand, it's not me who is, we always say I have a problem, so I'm not going to change. But it's actually something we have this body, we have a complex system, and the system might malfunction at times. So reattributing it kind of helps, gives us some amount of relief. And third is that refocus. So refocus is basically to direct your attention towards something else and actually try to add something more. And if you don't have the will to refocus, then always bring more people, like-minded people into the loop so you can refocus. Or come to clubs like this and we'll have like a group.
So you mentioned this top-down and the bottom-up framework, right, to understand the development of the organ. And then you kind of alluded that there could be a third framework to combine the two. But I think somebody asked, but probably that left got open. So what is that actually?
For that, we are basically we would love for many smart people like us to come and join us in our endeavor and help us build a better framework. So on the lighter note, but the idea is basically that, again, the DNA or the genome is basically responsible for setting up the initial hardware. Yeah. But then we also have we can also have a top-down approach where we can change the physiology itself through the top-down approach. So we don't want to, the goal is not to say one is better than the other, because that's not how it is. We want to understand what reality itself is. So the idea would be that the genome basically gives a really good test bed for actually implementing all these different physiologies of all these different softwares. I think that's the basic idea. So we want to say that we can say if we have a malfunctioning computer and if the hardware is bad, we can't do much on. We cannot just install and do different kinds of. We can't do different kinds of programs, run different kinds of programs on it. So the idea is basically to integrate the fact that we need a good starting point, which potentially is given by our genomic substance, and then above which we can also make small changes in our software itself to have different physiological things. I mean, that's my general understanding right now, but we should potentially work on it and evolve this idea. Yeah.
There's a saying that's coming to mind, which may not be scientifically rigorous, it may actually not even be philosophically rigorous. Okay. But I wanted to get your take on it. And the saying is, the system cannot know itself. And it sounds like this is a pursuit about the subject, trying to understand what the subject is and how it interacts in this, the model. So does that kind of worry you that inherently in this pursuit, there may be a paradox or like an impossibility in the in the problem and the approach itself.
No, I really like your point. It's so I was actually reading this article, I think it was in Big Thing, where they said that ultimately it would be impossible to actually understand what the origin of life is and what the origin of this universe is. And actually, a similar quotation is mentioned in our recent text, where it's in the Brahma Samhita, where they say, Pantastu koti shatavatsara sampragamyo, vayur atha muniva pungavanam. So it basically suggests that you may travel however fast you want, even at the speed of the mind, but you will never actually ultimately understand who you truly are, or without. And then there is of course a condition. The condition ultimately is there is a source of all the subjects, and potentially we are ultimately infinitesimal, and we can never understand the infinite. And that's something many mathematicians have actually, it's driven them to the mental asylum as well, because one of, there's no kidding actually, for instance, George Cantor, I don't know how many of you have heard of George Cantor's sets. So the famous Cantor wanted to understand what infinity is, and he's brilliant mathematician, but by the end of his life, he was driven to an asylum, because the more you get closer to infinity, the farther away it is. So the same idea kind of applies here. And so then the question is, who's the source of the subject? And that's a whole open question. And we can, I think a lot of it is basically discussed in some of the other sessions. So please do attend the other session. Yes.
Might be a little futuristic kind of a question, but for example, you showed the example of that organism developmental. Can we explore some top-down approaches to the fixed kind of diseases that people get, where bottom approaches are taken, for example, cancer and all that?
Absolutely.
That can be possible explored.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely, yeah, definitely. We should, I think, so one of the people in the group, we are actually trying to explore ideas like how even top-down approaches could help with even substance abuse disorders and all of that. So for instance, top-down approaches could be like even music meditation is a top-down approach, because you're actually meditating, or you're trying to consciously meditate on certain things. You're trying to direct your attention towards certain things. And that's, we've recently submitted a grant proposal to NSF also to actually study these things. So 100%, I think we're at least aligned on that thinking. We'll see how the results look, and we'll see, again, it's a statistical question. There was actually a recent study by some of the members in the group itself. I was not involved in the study, where they try to understand how different Sanskrit mantras actually affect your physical health. So one of the mantras is the Hare Krishna mantra, which most of you might have heard if you guys were hearing this. But the mantra goes Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. And the other mantra is more of a made-up Sanskrit mantra, like Tilla Kashta something something. Right? So they basically wanted to see. We have a control group who's not given any mantra. Then there's a group which gives the Hare Krishna mantra, and the other group is basically the Tilla Kashta mantra. And they want to see what are the physical changes in one's kind of physiology as they basically try this experiment over I think it's a 4-week duration. And one of the metrics that they use is something called heart rate variability. And heart rate variability should be actually high for a very healthy person. So athletes have very high heart rate variability. And what they've noticed is actually by regular chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra, in comparison to the made-up Sanskrit mantra, actually increases your heart rate variability. So there are some ideas that we are trying to kind of explore right now. But I think you should definitely join us, and we should have more conversations. So you can help if you're in that field, you can help us, like direct us to what are the cancer it's a multifactorial disease, and it's a very complex disease. So I don't want to simplify it by saying can be solved by the top-down approach, but at the same time, I think hybrid approaches are the way to go. So we should definitely, if that's your field of expertise, we should definitely speak about it. Yeah. Yes.
Would you like to share your contact information on the slides?
Oh, yeah. Actually, I surprisingly didn't put it on the slide. Let me just type it in then. So my next slide is something else. purely, never mind. I'm bad at this. All right, so here goes my. And this is the best way to contact me. I'll increase the font. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Take off.
So, as you brought in an interesting paradigm between even like bioelectricity and free will and how both sort of experiments were involving the way we can mental activity. As well, then I've also had opportunities to meet like quote unquote like urban monks who have implemented this kind of lifestyle where they have altered the way they live and for the better. So, and also coming from, also being exposed to Eastern philosophy, I do have an aligned interest in this. So do you have any recommended like readings, like a list of like readings?
Sure, definitely.
Practices and
Yeah, I think the best person for that is Sundaran, who's actually he's one of the club in charge also. And he can definitely share. I mean, I think this is a very active club, and there's a lot of people who regularly come and they practice, like he mentioned in the start, there's like cooking classes, there's mantra meditation that's happening, and there's a lot of reading as well that's happening. So reading from these wisdom texts. So one of the texts that I quoted from was the Bhagavad Gita, and that's, oh yeah, sure. Okay. Oh man, sorry. Let's see. All right, there you go. All right, so the texts themselves are yeah, I think both these texts are pretty they provide you with a very sound basis of Eastern philosophy itself and the philosophical frameworks. And one thing I found very amusing about Srimad Bhagavatam especially was when I was writing my introduction for my PhD thesis, I was thinking of history of my work is in artificial intelligence. I was thinking, what's the history of artificial intelligence? And usually when we think of history, we think of the Greeks. And we say the Greeks have done this and this. So I was like curious, I'm going to like read the entire Bhagavatam and see if there is a mention of something about artificial intelligence. And it's interesting, the third volume of the Srimad Bhagavatam, there's actually a description of birds. So there are live swans and live pigeons. And there are also life-like pigeons and life-like swans that actually have competitions. So we don't know what the mechanism itself is, but it's interesting to see such a description. And this text is specifically 5,000 years old, has been composed like close to 5,000 years ago. So it kind of sets, it makes you wonder what human civilization could have been, or at least thinking about such interesting ideas 5,000 years ago. So it's a very fascinating piece.
Like the Bhagavad Gita, the Srimad Bhagavatam also have different commentators, and like whose version would you like?
Yes, so we have a version written by oh yeah, sure. Jeez. I think I got it just like, this is interesting. So the version, do we have some books out here by any chance?
Yeah, we have some books.
Actually, we have some Bhagavad Gitas, but there's, yeah, correct, thank you. So it's called, both are written by the same author, and author's name is oh yeah, I did the book. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is kind of unique in its way because it's one of the very few English. Oh, sorry guys, thank you. Clearly, I need to train my mind. Yeah, so it's unique in its way because it's authentic. At the same time, it's in English. So those who may not know Sanskrit, you can actually access it. It's pretty accessible. I'm sure they also have reading sessions. So the best way to learn these texts, like I've talked earlier also, there's a lot of metaphors and sometimes it's very terse, so it's always nice to read in a group. So I think they would have reading sessions so we can figure out what times and everything. So we should totally do it.
Because that's a very interesting text.
Yes.
We talk about
Yes. Yeah. So the 100%. So yeah, the Upanishads are also phenomenal, like the Prashna Upanishad, Kena Upanishad. The Katha Upanishad specifically had this the example of the chariot. But yeah, I don't think at this point we're studying the Upanishads themselves, but once we finish these base books, we get to the Upanishads. I think that thank you so much everyone for for first of all standing and attending. I'm grateful, and yeah, okay.
You wanted to say something, Ashish?
I just wanted to put out the way, I mean, if you want to kind of dive deeper in some of these areas, so like we send you an email what's the modus operandi of that, like?
Yeah, I mean, I think just in your title, just like say Stanford Conscious Club or Stanford Neuro Mind, and and whatever interests, and maybe ideally I would like to know what your profile is, like if you're a researcher and working on certain topics, if not just excited about working on certain areas. What I'll also do is when you guys RSVP, you also left an email IDs, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So then what I can do is maybe those who are interested, maybe I can just like take your names down and I can send you a list of topics that we've already been exploring, like the topics that I showed from the first slide. I don't want to like take your time. Sorry, guys. It's going to be very quick. Okay, there you go. So there are a bunch of topics, and I'm sure each one of us will find something that's very fascinating and exciting to us. This is my hobby work, I would say, because this is post 5 p.m. Startup work. So this, yeah.
So there could be a 17th topic also, right? Or is it limited to?
Oh yeah, there could be a 17th topic, of course. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, for those of you who are interested, you can exchange your contacts with Guru Prasad. We'd like to thank Guru Prasad once again.
Thank you
for giving this talk and so entertaining a lot of questions and a lot of interest in these topics. So thank you again for engaging in this discussion. And Stanford Conscious Living, we bring all these interesting topics. So please do join us. If you're not part of a mailing list or WhatsApp group, please join. We'll give you contact information. And as Guru Prasad was leading, we also have the reading of these wisdom texts. So if you're interested, please feel free to reach out and we're happy to. Thank you once again. And there is also dinner waiting for you. So see you all again.